Welcome to The Explainer. Today we are going to explore one of history's absolute most fascinating and profound institutional evolutions. We're going to trace the blueprint of how a humble, highly skilled guild of ancient stonecutters slowly and meticulously shaped the philosophical foundation of the modern world. It is, at its core, an incredible story of survival, adaptation, and just a profound intellectual transformation. Okay, let's dive into this. The core question we have to answer today is, how exactly did an ancient, totally practical guild of men who literally cut rock from the earth, transformed into the philosophical architects of the modern Enlightenment? Because this wasn't just some sudden random leap, it was actually a desperate survival story of an ancient trade pivoting to intellectual architecture when their very existence was on the line. To map this out, we're going to move through 5 distinct architectural phases: the Roman foundations, the pillars of the medieval guilds, a sudden and massive 16th century crisis, the radical shift to speculative masonry, and finally, the massive 1717 paradigm shift over in London. Let's start right at the base with Phase 1, foundations, the Roman builders. Our chronological construction really begins with the slow, highly methodical work of Antiquity. And this brilliantly illustrates our historical narrative, kind of like the anatomy of a cathedral. Down at the base, we have the heavy Roman foundations in that monastic preservation during the Dark Ages. Then, moving up, the soaring pillars representing the medieval Gothic boom. And finally, sitting right at the top, the intricately designed capstone, which represents those speculative intellectuals of the 17th century and the creation of the premier Grand Lodge. So zooming in on that foundation, we find the Collegia Fabrorum of the 6th century BC. Now, as the Roman Empire expanded, their legions obviously brought immense conquest and, naturally, a ton of destruction. But the Roman engine required order, so you had these organized groups of professional builders, the collegiati, trailing right behind the military. They essentially turned the chaos of war into systematic reconstruction. They rebuilt temples, public works, entire cities. And crucially, they viewed this act of building not just as manual labor, but as a sacred cult to the divinities. But, of course, empires fall. When the Western Roman Empire collapsed in 476 AD, Europe plunged into ruin and barbarism. The sacred royal art of construction could have easily been lost forever. Actually, it almost was. However, it found this highly secure, clerics-only refuge in the monasteries during the Dark Ages. These monastic friars fiercely protected and preserved these architectural secrets for centuries. Eventually, they started training laymen as Europe stabilized, which led right up to the pivotal York Convention of 926 AD, establishing the early statutes for these emerging builders. Which brings us to Phase 2, pillars, the Operative Medieval Guilds. This stabilization leads us directly into the massive structural pillars of our historical cathedral. The very word Freemason actually stems from a pretty fascinating etymological split. Over in France, Franc-Maçon referred to artisans who were granted immense legal privileges by the church. They were literally free from taxes and feudal status, and they could travel wherever they wanted. Meanwhile, in England, Freestone Mason was a super practical term. It meant elite workers who were skilled enough to carve high-quality, fine-grained freestone into perfect cubes. But both origins really highlight the same thing, an elite class of operative working builders. Phase 3, the 16th century crisis. Because, well, nothing lasts forever. As we hit the 16th century, these operative guilds suddenly face a terrifying existential threat. Their entire world was just about to collapse. Imagine a sort of survival funnel, just totally constricting these builders. For centuries, the Gothic architectural boom sustained these wealthy, powerful guilds. But then, boom, the Renaissance hits. Almost overnight, Gothic architecture is seen as completely outdated, and there's this massive aesthetic shift back to Greco-Roman styles, heavily championed in England by architects like Inigo Jones. At the exact same time, monarchs start growing super suspicious of the guild's power. King Francis I of France straight up revokes their privileges in 1539, and Queen Elizabeth I even orders their assemblies dissolved in 1561. The builders are literally facing irrelevance and complete financial ruin. Phase 4, speculative masonry and the Enlightenment. To survive this funnel, the operative guilds made a radical, absolutely unprecedented adaptation. They opened their lodge doors to men who had never laid a single physical stone in their lives. So the crucial point is exactly when this happened, and historical ledgers give us the timeline. In 1600, over in Scotland, John Boswell is received as an accepted, or non-working Mason. By the 1640s, the English military and intellectual elite are infiltrating the ranks. You've got men like Lieutenant General Robert Murray in 1641 and the renowned antiquarian Elias Ashmole in 1646. These speculative members were suddenly joining working lodges, and it was a trend that was about to accelerate. And then we get a massive catalyst, the Great Fire of London in 1666. It was an absolute catastrophe. It decimated 40,000 houses and 86 churches. But it also required an unprecedented rebuilding effort. Operative stonemasons flocked to London, and they were directed by the renowned architect and speculative mason Sir Christopher Wren. So, in the churchyard of the rebuilding St. Paul's Cathedral, this incredible scene unfolded. At a local pub called the Goose and Gridiron Tavern, you had calloused blue-collar working builders and elite Enlightenment thinkers suddenly socializing and laboring side by side. Now, you might be wondering, why did the intellectual elite want to join a stonecutters guild in the first place? Like, why does this matter? Well, because the lodges offered something incredibly rare in the Enlightenment era. They provided a legally recognized, licit form of association during a time that was deeply suspicious of secret gatherings. But more importantly, they offered a safe sanctuary for free expression. This was a place away from the dogmatism of medieval theology and, quite frankly, the watchful eye of the Inquisition. These intellectuals basically co-opted the Masons' pre-existing international network so they could safely share revolutionary humanist philosophy across borders. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is just how absolute the contrast is between the old world and the new. The operative masons of the Middle Ages, they existed to erect physical cathedrals using literal squares, compasses, and hammers just to secure their trade wages. But the speculative masons of the Enlightenment, completely different. They were aristocrats, scientists. Their purpose wasn't physical building. It was the moral perfection of man. They didn't use literal tools. They used those builders' tools as profound philosophical metaphors for ethics, duty, and equality. And that brings us to the top. Phase 5, the 1717 paradigm shift. This quiet infiltration and merging of minds inevitably led to the installation of the institution's true capstone, the birth of modern Freemasonry. The exact date is June 24th, 1717, St. John the Baptist's Day. Led by the highly intellectual Reverend Jean Théophile des Agaliers, representatives from 4 distinct London tavern lodges convened. Those were the Goose and Gridiron, the Crown, the Apple Tree, and the Rummer and Grapes. Let's move to and see how this builds into something completely revolutionary. You see, before 1717, the rule was a Freemason and a free lodge. Lodges were entirely independent, scattered local clubs with absolutely zero external subordination. But on that specific day in 1717, they created the premier Grand Lodge. They implanted what's called the obediential system, a centralized global power structure governed by a Grand Master. Literally overnight, it transformed a dying network of trade guilds into a highly systematized philosophical powerhouse. And we actually have primary source validation of exactly why they did this. In James Anderson's 1738 Constitution, he writes that after the end of the rebellion in 1716, the few remaining lodges in London felt neglected by Sir Christopher Wren. So, to survive, they, quote, thought fit to cement under a Grand Master as the center of union and harmony. It was a highly deliberate structural unification meant to preserve their brotherhood. So to summarize this really remarkable journey, driven by the aesthetic pressures of the Renaissance and the total rapid decline of the Gothic world, a practical union of literal stonecutters evolved into an intellectual sanctuary. Freemasonry didn't abandon the art of building. They simply changed their materials. They swapped literal stones for philosophical metaphors to shape the moral, social, and intellectual fabric of man, attempting to erect an entirely new, enlightened society. Which brings us to a final thought for you to take away from this explainer. These ancient builders adapted to survive, elevating their craft from the physical shaping of stone to the shaping of society itself. So, as we look at the complex architecture of our modern world, we really have to ask ourselves, utilizing the tools, the networks, and the incredible knowledge we have at our disposal right now, what are we building today?